The rain came like a whispered promise at first, gentle enough to be dismissed as nothing more than a passing spring shower. But within an hour, it transformed into a torrential downpour, turning the streets of the small town into rushing rivers of murky water. Helen stood at the doorway of her modest home, peering out into the chaos. Her arthritis had kept her inside for days, her brittle bones locking her into a world of quiet loneliness. But today, something was different. A sound, a whimper, broke through the roar of the storm. Her eyes narrowed in disbelief. In the distance, near the far corner of the street, a small, struggling figure emerged from the floodwaters, a dog. Its fur was matted and heavy with the weight of the rain. The creature stumbled, faltered, then fell, its fragile body barely clinging to life as it struggled against the current. Helen's heart leaped into her throat. She knew she had to act. But what if it was too late? What if the dog was beyond saving? Her hands shook as she grabbed her old coat, barely managing to wrap it around her trembling frame. The world outside was a nightmare, an unrelenting deluge of water and wind. Yet, Helen could hear nothing but the distant, desperate cries of the dog. Your support keeps us going. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The rain began as a soft murmur, a steady drumming on the roof, a promise of something more. Helen sat by her window, her old hands resting in her lap. The pain of age had settled into her bones, making every movement a labor, but she didn't mind. She had grown used to the stillness of her life, the quiet hum of the world outside her small cottage. The storm didn't concern her, not at first. It was just a passing shower, a few fleeting moments of heavy drops, before the sun would break through and warm the earth again. But then, the storm intensified. The rain came down in sheets, as though the sky had opened up, and with it, a fierce wind that howled like a living thing. Trees bent in the relentless gusts, and the air seemed to vibrate with the power of the storm. Helen's eyes narrowed as she glanced out the window again. The water was rising quickly. Her garden, once lush with flowers, was now submerged, and the streets outside had begun to resemble rivers. It was the worst flood she had seen in years. She was about to turn away, to retreat further into the warmth of her home, when something caught her attention. A faint whimper, barely audible against the roar of the storm, tugged at her heart. Helen leaned closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered through the rain-streaked pane. And then she saw it, at the far end of the street, a tiny figure struggling against the rising waters. A dog, its body, small and frail, was being dragged by the current, its limbs flailing as it fought to keep its head above the floodwaters. The dog's fur was a soggy mess, clinging to its body like a second skin. Its eyes were wide with panic, and Helen could see the fear in them, a fear she knew all too well. Her heart clenched in her chest. The dog was in trouble. It was alone, struggling, and if no one intervened, it would drown. The thought twisted her stomach, but the next wave of water was already swallowing it whole. Helen's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the windowsill. The storm outside was unforgiving, the world becoming a blur of gray and water. She could feel the weight of the moment settle on her. This was her chance, her one chance to do something to save a life. But could she? The floodwaters were high, and her body was old. Her legs ached, her bones creaked with each passing day, and every movement was a battle against the relentless grip of arthritis. The pain in her joints felt unbearable at times, but the thought of the dog, struggling in the flood, was stronger than any of her physical discomforts. She couldn't just sit here and watch it suffer. Without thinking, she grabbed her old coat, the one that had been hanging by the door for years. She barely managed to wrap it around her shoulders, her hands shaking with the effort. The house seemed distant as she made her way toward the door, each step slow and deliberate, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The moment she stepped outside, the storm hit her like a slap in the face. The cold, heavy rain soaked through her clothes instantly, and the wind nearly knocked her off her feet. The streets, once familiar, now looked like a river, the water rushing and swirling, carrying debris in its wake. But Helen didn't hesitate. The dog needed her. She pressed on, each step a struggle. The water hit her shins, then her knees, and soon it was rising higher, lapping at her thighs. She could barely see through the downpour, But she knew the dog was still there, still fighting. She reached out, her arms shaking with exertion, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The water was pushing against her, but she refused to stop. And then she saw it again, those wide, fearful eyes staring at her through the water. The dog was close now, so close, but it was barely able to stay afloat. Its head was dipping under the current, and Helen could feel her heart stop in her chest. She couldn't lose it now. She pushed through the water, feeling it pull at her, trying to drag her down with it. But she wasn't going to let that happen. With one final burst of strength, she reached out and grabbed the dog's scruff, pulling it close to her chest. The water seemed to fight against them, but she held on tight, cradling the dog in her arms like a fragile treasure. For a moment, she just stood there, the storm raging around them, her body trembling from the cold and the effort. But the dog was alive. It was in her arms, its small body warm against hers, its heart beating steadily, just as hers was. She didn't know how long it took to get back to her house, but every step was slower than the last. The floodwaters had risen higher, and she was fighting to keep her footing, her legs heavy and aching with each movement. But Helen didn't care. She was doing this. She was saving this life. Finally, she reached the safety of her home, her front door creaking as she shoved it open. The warmth of the house hit her immediately, but she barely registered it. She only had one thought: get the dog dry. She moved quickly, gently setting the trembling dog down on a thick towel by the fireplace. It lay there, shivering uncontrollably, its eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. Helen could barely breathe. She knew the dog had been through so much, but it was alive. That's all that mattered. As she knelt beside it, her hands trembling, she spoke softly, the words meant for herself as much as for the dog. "You're safe now. You're safe." The storm continued to rage outside, but in that small, quiet room, there was only the steady crackling of the fire and the soft, desperate breaths of the dog. Helen, too, was breathing a little easier now, her body still aching, but her heart lighter. She had saved it. And in doing so, she realized maybe she had saved herself too. The rain outside persisted, a constant, unrelenting force. Inside, Helen sat by the fire, her feet up on the hearth, watching the small dog curled up beside her. The glow from the flames flickered across the room, casting long, dancing shadows. The house was quiet now, too quiet. The storm, though fierce, had become a mere background to the stillness that enveloped her. Helen had always been a woman of routine. Her days were small, but they were hers. She'd long ago learned to find comfort in the rhythms of life, even when the world outside seemed to fade away. But this was different. This dog, this fragile creature she had pulled from the chaos, had come into her life in a way she never expected. And now, as she sat in the quiet of the room, she was left alone with the weight of her decision. She watched the dog, Chance, as it shifted in its sleep, its body curling tighter as the warmth from the fire reached its fur. Her hand instinctively reached out, but she hesitated, the frailty of the dog's body reminding her of her own. She wasn't sure what had possessed her to do it, to take the dog in. Was it just the act of kindness, a moment of heroism that would fade once the storm had passed? Or was there something deeper, something that had been quietly gnawing at her for months, perhaps years, that had made this moment feel so inevitable? Helen exhaled slowly, her thoughts clouded by doubt. She could see the dog's fragile body, the thinness of its frame, the sharpness of its ribs beneath the damp fur. It was a small thing, an animal that had likely been discarded, forgotten, tossed into the world to fend for itself. And yet, in its eyes, Helen saw something she hadn't seen in years: hope. But that hope felt fragile, fleeting, like a flicker of light that might vanish as quickly as it had come. She'd never thought of herself as a pet person, never considered the idea of taking in a stray. Not after Tom died. After his passing, Helen had turned inward, retreating into herself, letting her home become a place where time moved slowly, where memories lingered in every corner. She hadn't needed anything else. She had her books, her knitting, her quiet walks through the garden, and the comforting hum of the radio in the background. She didn't need to be responsible for anything else. Not after everything she'd already lost. And now, there was this dog. What did she know about caring for a dog? What if she couldn't do it? What if she couldn't offer the care it needed? She had never been the sort of person who handled responsibility lightly. And here she was, with an animal that relied on her, one that would need food, attention, love, things she wasn't sure she had to give anymore. Her eyes lingered on the dog, now resting its head on the towel, the steady rise and fall of its chest like a quiet reassurance. But even that wasn't enough to soothe the gnawing feeling in her stomach. She didn't know if she could do this, if she was the right person for this. Maybe it was too much. The idea of giving it up, of returning it to the shelter or finding it a new home, crept into her mind. It would be the easy thing to do, the sensible thing. But she had always prided herself on her ability to make the right choice, to weigh her decisions carefully, and this time, she couldn't. Her hands trembled again as she adjusted the towel beneath Chance's head. She hadn't felt this uncertain in years. But as the dog's eyes opened, looking up at her with a quiet trust, something in Helen shifted. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about this small creature, this fragile being that had been left to drown in a flooded street, this animal who now depended on her for everything. Her heart tightened in her chest as the weight of that responsibility settled in. Could she bear to break that trust? Helen's mind raced. She had to make a decision. She could continue her life as she always had, retreating further into herself, leaving Chance to find someone else, someone more equipped to care for it. Or she could rise to the occasion, step out of her comfort zone, and give this dog the chance it deserved. Her heart ached as she thought of what that would mean for her. It would mean letting go of her own fears, her own doubts, and stepping into a world she had long abandoned. But it could also mean something more, a life, a bond, a purpose she hadn't known she was missing. She glanced at the clock on the wall, its ticking filling the silence. It was a quiet reminder that time, too, was something she had no control over. And in this moment, Helen knew that she couldn't afford to waste any more of it. The dog shifted again, its eyes meeting hers as if waiting for her to make her decision. Its body was still frail, but its gaze was steady, trusting. And just like that, the doubt began to fade, replaced by something she hadn't expected: hope. "All right, Chance," Helen whispered to the dog, her voice soft but resolute. "I'm not sure what's ahead, but I'll do my best. You're not alone anymore." And with that, a new chapter began, not just for the dog but for Helen, too. She didn't know what would come of this decision, but she knew one thing: she had a purpose again. For the first time in years, the weight of her doubt began to lift, replaced by the certainty that, for once, she was doing the right thing. The days that followed the storm were slow and steady, marked by small triumphs and quiet moments of growth. The storm had passed, but the floodwaters still clung to the streets, like memories of a battle fought in the dark. Helen found herself in a new rhythm, one that centered around Chance, feeding it, tending to it, offering comfort in the quiet moments of the day. The dog, once frail and trembling, now moved with a hesitant energy, its small body filling out, the ribs that had once shone so clearly now softened beneath its growing coat. The house was warmer with Chance's presence, its small body a constant reminder that life was unpredictable, full of surprises, and sometimes even the quietest, most solitary moments could be transformed. The fire crackled in the hearth, the flames casting long shadows across the room, and for the first time in years, Helen could feel the pulse of life in her home. It was as though the stillness that had once held her captive had lifted, leaving room for something new to bloom. Helen had always been one to find comfort in routine. After her husband's death, she had wrapped herself in the simplicity of her days. She had avoided change, staying within the walls of her small world, afraid to face the uncertainties that lurked beyond. But now, with Chance, that world was slowly expanding. Every morning, she would wake to the soft rustling sound of the dog's paws against the wooden floors, the quiet shuffle of its steps as it made its way to her side, waiting for its breakfast. She hadn't realized how much she missed this, the companionship, the connection, until it was here again. She took Chance for walks in the early mornings, when the world was still heavy with mist. The streets, still damp from the storm, glistened in the soft light of dawn. The dog bounded ahead of her, its energy uncontained, its tail wagging with an enthusiasm that made Helen smile. The more Chance grew stronger, the more Helen felt herself becoming lighter. The aches in her body, though still present, were overshadowed by the joy of seeing the dog so full of life. Each walk was a small victory, a reminder that growth wasn't always about big changes. Sometimes it was in the smallest moments. Chance began to trust her, and Helen could see it in the way the dog looked at her. It wasn't just the instinctual trust of an animal who had been rescued. It was something deeper. The dog was beginning to look to her not just for care, but for comfort. Its eyes, once filled with fear, were now filled with a kind of quiet acceptance, a sense of safety that Helen had never expected. It followed her everywhere, from the kitchen to the small garden out back, its eyes always trained on her, as though it were waiting for her next move. One evening, as Helen sat in her favorite chair by the window, the dog curled up at her feet, she realized just how much she had changed in the past few weeks. Her world, once a silent void, had been filled with sound again. The soft clink of the dog's collar as it moved, the scratch of its paws against the wooden floors, the little noises of its contentment. All of it felt like a melody she hadn't known she was missing. Her days had become a quiet dance of giving and receiving, of learning how to care for another living being after years of being alone. But it wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about her, too. Helen had been forced to confront the parts of herself she had buried for so long. The doubts, the fears, the loneliness. Those were the things she had kept hidden, tucked away behind the walls of her home. But now, with Chance beside her, she had no choice but to face them. She hadn't realized just how deeply her solitude had affected her until she saw the joy that Chance brought to her life. It was as if the dog had unlocked something inside her, something she had forgotten. In caring for Chance, she had rediscovered a piece of herself that had been lost in the years of quiet isolation. She found herself talking more, laughing at the dog's silly antics, and feeling a connection to the world outside that she hadn't felt in so long. As the days turned into weeks, Helen's confidence grew. She knew she wasn't perfect, that there were still so many things she didn't know about caring for a dog, but she was learning, and that, in itself, was a victory. She took Chance to the local park, watching as the dog explored the grass and chased after butterflies, its small body moving with a joy that was contagious. Helen couldn't help but laugh. The sound of her own laughter strange but sweet in her ears. It had been years since she had allowed herself to laugh like that. The other residents of the neighborhood began to take notice of Helen and Chance. At first, people had offered quiet glances, unsure of what to make of the old woman and the dog. But soon, those glances turned into smiles, and those smiles turned into conversations. Helen found herself exchanging small pleasantries with neighbors she hadn't spoken to in years. They asked about the dog, how it was doing, how it had come to her. And each time she told the story, it felt like she was sharing a little bit of herself with them. It was as though Chance had not only opened her heart, but had begun to open doors to the world outside. One afternoon, as Helen and Chance walked down the now dry street, the dog stopped abruptly, its ears perking up at a sound. Helen followed its gaze and saw a small child standing on the porch of a house a few doors down, staring at them with wide, curious eyes. The child was holding a ball, its small hand gripping it tightly, and Helen could see the hesitation in the child's gaze. "Would you like to play?" Helen called softly, her voice carrying through the quiet air. The child hesitated for a moment, then nodded, a bright smile spreading across their face. The ball rolled toward them, and Chance darted forward, barking excitedly as it chased after it. The child laughed, and Helen's heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in a long time: connection. As she watched Chance play with the child, her eyes followed the dog's every move. It was full of life, full of joy, and it was giving that joy to everyone around it. And for the first time, Helen understood that in saving Chance, she had saved herself too. She wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in years, she wasn't just living, she was alive. The days following the new routines felt oddly like the calm before another storm, a quiet anticipation hanging in the air, just beyond Helen's reach. Her life had become full of moments she hadn't dared hope for. Laughter, companionship, warmth. Chance, the little dog that had been saved from the flood, had become a part of her every day. But despite all the joy that the dog had brought her, Helen felt a nagging weight that she couldn't shake. It wasn't that she wanted to give Chance up. No, that was the furthest thought from her heart. But deep down, she knew that her small house and fragile health couldn't provide the kind of life this dog truly deserved. As much as she loved Chance, she was aware of her limitations. The world outside was big and full of opportunity, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the dog was meant for more than this small house, this quiet life. She had spent so many years closing herself off from the world, but now, in caring for Chance, she had learned to see beyond her walls. And she knew that Chance, so full of life, energy, and promise, needed more than she could offer. It wasn't a decision Helen arrived at lightly. She spent countless nights in front of the fire, Chance curled at her feet, pondering what was best for the dog. She had grown to love it, to feel the connection she hadn't felt with anyone in years. The thought of losing that, of giving up something so precious, seemed unbearable. But the reality was undeniable. Chance deserved a better future, and Helen knew she had to let go, if only for the sake of the dog's happiness. The decision weighed heavily on her, and it was on one of those quiet evenings, as she sat with the dog on her lap, that she made the call. It was a local animal shelter, one known for finding homes for dogs with special needs. The woman on the other end was kind, understanding, but it was clear that there was no easy way to make this choice. Helen felt the warmth of the dog against her chest, and a tear slipped down her cheek. "I think it's time," she whispered to herself. "It's time for you to have the life you deserve." The phone call lasted only a few minutes, but those minutes stretched into an eternity. The decision was made, and with it came a wave of guilt, sadness, and uncertainty. Would she be doing the right thing? Would the shelter find someone who would love Chance as much as she had? But Helen knew the answer. She couldn't give the dog the life it needed, the full life it deserved. And for that reason she had to be brave. Braver than she'd ever been. She had to let go of the only companion she had come to rely on. Later that week, the shelter worker, a woman named Sarah, came to pick up Chance. Helen's hands shook as she opened the door to let her in. Sarah was young, her eyes soft, but full of the kind of resolve Helen had come to admire. She had heard Helen's story over the phone, and she understood. She didn't try to convince Helen to keep the dog, nor did she attempt to soften the inevitable. "I'll take good care of him," Sarah said quietly, her voice warm but firm. Helen nodded, unable to speak for the lump in her throat. It was a finality she wasn't ready for but knew was necessary. She bent down to kiss Chance's head one last time, the dog looking up at her with its big, trusting eyes. Its tail wagged once, a soft, tentative movement. Helen's heart broke in that moment, but there was no going back. "Go," she whispered, tears slipping down her face. "Go, and have the life you deserve." Chance didn't resist. With Sarah's gentle coaxing, the dog walked toward the woman, pausing for a moment to glance back at Helen. It was as if the dog understood, as if it knew this was goodbye. And then, just like that, it was gone. Helen watched from the doorway as Sarah walked down the street, a Chance happily trotting beside her. The storm had passed, the waters had receded, and so had the ache in Helen's chest. She closed the door softly, standing in the quiet of the room, the stillness surrounding her like a blanket. For the first time in years, Helen felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the peace of having everything in place, but the peace that came from knowing she had done the right thing. She had given Chance a chance at life, one that would be full of possibility, joy, and love. And though it hurt, Helen knew she had made the right decision. She sat by the fire, the emptiness in the room stark against the warmth of the flames. It felt different now, quiet, but not in the same way as before. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was filled with the memory of a life she had saved, of a bond that had been forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. Helen wasn't sure what the future held, but she had learned something vital in the past weeks. Love was not measured by how long you kept something, but by the freedom you gave it to grow. And in the act of letting go, she had found a strength she hadn't known she had. The weeks after Chance's departure were not as lonely as Helen had feared. The silence in the house, though profound, was not oppressive. It was filled with the quiet echoes of memories. Memories of a little dog that had brought so much life into her world. In the stillness, Helen found a new rhythm, one that was less about her own solitude and more about the way the world around her had changed. Sarah had kept in touch, sending occasional updates about Chance's new life. The dog had adjusted well to its new home, spending its days running through fields, playing with other dogs, and enjoying the kind of carefree existence that Helen knew it deserved. The updates brought her a sense of comfort, a reassurance that her decision had been the right one. Chance was thriving, happy, and loved. But it wasn't just Chance who had changed. Helen, too, had found herself growing in ways she hadn't expected. She had joined a local book club, something she'd always wanted to do but never had the courage for. She spent more time in the garden, her flowers blooming with the same care she had once given to Chance. She was no longer the woman who had hidden away from the world, afraid of change. She was someone new, someone who had found the courage to face her fears, to embrace the uncertainties of life, and to let go of what she couldn't control. One afternoon, as Helen walked through the garden, her cane tapping gently against the path, she stopped to admire the flowers that had come into bloom. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden light over the garden, and for a brief moment, Helen felt a profound sense of peace. She wasn't alone anymore, and she never would be. Weeks had passed since Chance had left, and Helen was learning to live in the quiet space that had once seemed so unbearable. The house, though still filled with echoes of the little dog's presence, felt different now. There was a peace in the air, an unspoken understanding that life had moved on. The silence was no longer something to fear, but something to cherish. It was in this silence that Helen found her own strength, a strength she hadn't known she had. The days flowed gently, each one similar to the last. The rhythms of life, once slow and burdensome, now felt lighter. Helen spent her mornings tending to the garden she had neglected for so long. The flowers that had once withered under her inattentiveness were now vibrant, alive, and full of color. The garden was no longer just a place of beauty. It had become a reflection of her own healing, of her decision to embrace change and let go of the past. It was on one of these quiet mornings, as Helen bent down to adjust the soil around a stubborn rosebush, that she realized how much had changed. The ache in her heart that had once felt so raw had dulled, replaced by something new. She had thought that letting Chance go would leave a hole in her life, an emptiness she would never fill. But instead, she had found space for something else, something that was hers to nurture, to care for, something that didn't require her to hold on so tightly. Helen stood up slowly, wiping the dirt from her hands. Her bones ached, and her body was tired, but there was a quiet contentment in her movements. As she turned to head back to the porch, she caught sight of a figure walking down the street. It was a woman, holding a small bundle in her arms. At first, Helen didn't recognize her, but then the woman raised her hand in greeting, and Helen saw the familiar warmth in her eyes. It was Sarah. Sarah had come to visit, bringing an update about Chance. Helen's heart fluttered as she stepped forward, a smile spreading across her face despite the unease she still felt about the decision she had made. "I thought I'd stop by," Sarah said softly. The dog nestled in her arms. "Chance wanted to see you." Helen's heart skipped a beat. She had known, of course, that Sarah had kept her updated on the dog's progress, but seeing Chance again, alive, healthy, and so full of energy, was something she hadn't expected. The dog's fur was shiny, its eyes bright and full of the joy Helen had hoped for. As Sarah knelt down to let Chance out of her arms, the dog darted toward Helen, its tail wagging with excitement. The reunion was simple but filled with an overwhelming sense of relief and joy. For a moment, Helen stood frozen, watching as Chance circled around her, its small body bouncing with excitement. The dog stopped in front of her, its eyes locking with hers in a silent moment of recognition. And then, without hesitation, Chance leapt into her arms. Helen laughed, the sound of it surprising her. She hadn't laughed like this in years, and it felt like a weight had been lifted from her chest. "Thank you," Helen said, looking up at Sarah, who was watching the scene with a smile. "I didn't expect this. I knew Chance would want to see you," Sarah replied, her voice full of warmth. "He's happy here, but I think he'll always remember what you did for him, what you gave him." Helen looked down at the dog in her arms, its eyes calm and full of trust. It was true. Chance had been her chance, too. A chance to heal, to reconnect with the world outside her walls, to rediscover a part of herself she had long buried. She hadn't just given the dog a second chance at life, it had given her one, too. "I never thought I could love again," Helen whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "But I think, in a way, I've learned that love doesn't always mean holding on. Sometimes it's about letting go." Sarah nodded, understanding the depth of Helen's words. "You gave him what he needed, and now you've let him go. That's real love." Helen looked down at Chance, who was nuzzling her neck with a soft whimper. It was clear now that her decision had been the right one. She had let go, not out of obligation, but out of love. And in doing so, she had given Chance the chance he deserved, the chance to thrive, to find his own happiness. And in return, he had given her something even more precious, a sense of peace. The two women stood in the soft morning light, watching as Chance ran around the garden, his joy infectious. It was a small moment, but in it, Helen felt the fullness of life. How fragile it could be, how unpredictable, but also how beautiful. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its golden light across the flowers in the garden, Helen knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Her heart, once full of doubt and hesitation, had been filled again. By the dog she had saved, by the love she had given, and by the realization that, sometimes, letting go was the bravest thing a person could do. For the first time in a long time, Helen felt truly alive, connected to the world around her, and at peace with the journey she had taken. And as she watched Chance play in the garden, the sound of his joyful barks filling the air, she knew she had found something more than just a new beginning. She had found home.